My name is Irene Gunther. I'm a professor of history at the University of Houston and the Honors College, and I'm proud to present my spring 2020 10 o'clock class, Students Projects. We focused on the Great Migration of more than 6 million African Americans out of the South to other regions of the United States in the North and in the West. They fled oppression and brutality in the South and hoped to find better opportunities and more fulfilled lives in other parts of the United States. That movement, that Great Migration, transformed American culture, society, and politics in countless ways. And so as we read and we researched, students then focused on particular issues that they transformed into creative projects. Those projects range from photography and film to literature, art, short story, digital projects, and music projects to educate themselves and the public about this transformative yet largely unrecognized movement, the consequences of which we still feel today. We hope, both my students and I, that you will share these videos with friends and perhaps also with people you're not so familiar with who might be interested in learning more about the Great Migration and about the ways in which that Great Migration transformed our American nation, both when it occurred and still today. In this moment of national reckoning on racism, we hope that you will find that these projects resonate not only with this moment, but also will resonate more generally with your understanding of American history. Enjoy. In his in-depth research paper, Carlos Benitez first looks at the science of eugenics, which became widely popular here in the United States in the early 1900s. Taught in high schools as well as in colleges, states made legal the forced sterilization of citizens in order to, quote, breed the best with the best. Those sterilizations became further legal in the Supreme Court ruling Buck versus Bell in 1927. In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, sterilizations were legal. He then goes on to look at Black maternal and infant mortality rates, which are more than double that of white mothers and white infants. And while the discrepancy seemed initially difficult for him to figure out, after much research, Carlos concluded that discrimination leads to a stressful life and a stress-filled life, and that those constant daily microaggressions have very negative effects on health. Discrimination causes heart disease, and it also causes faster cellular aging. And so maternal mortality rates as well as infant mortality rates among Black communities are far higher than in white communities.
So the project itself is a multi-layer painting, meaning there are 2 different layers. The first layer is a crying child in a blue hue, which I chose to intrigue the observer, encouraging them to ask the question, why are they crying? The purpose of the blue hue was to highlight the depressive aura around the painting, emphasizing its seriousness. The second layer consists of a collage of newspaper articles that reported on lynchings. I wanted the observer to understand how often this horrendous act occurred, so to achieve that, I made sure each article came from a different state. I also made the letters red, emphasizing the bloodshed in these moments and underscoring its overall brutality. These separate layers came together whenever you shine a light behind the painting, as the once invisible newspaper articles become fully apparent on the face of the crying child. This is meant to symbolize the underlying danger Black Americans face daily, along with the pain that came with it. The observer doesn't initially understand why the child is crying. However, once the light shines through, it's obvious what's wrong. The child is confused and scared of the reality that comes with living in the South and across the nation, pushing him to tears. Simultaneously, the choices of red, white, and blue being the primary colors reflect the American flag, bringing attention to the nation as a whole. Its purpose is to once again remind the observer that this wasn't an issue exclusive to the South. It was an issue that plagued the nation.
My Name is Jim Crow is a poem about the Jim Crow system, a deeply discriminatory system that was based on laws as well as practices. In the South, it was a legal system, and in the North, it was largely sustained by fact practices and behaviors. The poem shows the point of view of both the people who implemented Jim Crow and did everything that they could to continue it, as well as the African American community that had to endure living under those Jim Crow laws. Eventually, the characters in The Warmth of Other Suns, also mentioned in the poem, as well as 6 million other African Americans fled the South in the hopes of finding better opportunities and more fulfilled lives in the North and in the West. The system of Jim Crow would last until well into the 1960s in the United States, although most historians argue that the by-fact practices of Jim Crow continue still to this day in areas such as real estate, segregated neighborhoods, and segregated schools by fact.
Hi, I'm Adair. So for my piece Vacancy, my inspiration was directly from The Warmth of Other Suns by Rebecca Wilkerson. There's a scene in the book where one of the characters is migrating across sort of the desert of America over to California from more east, and he can't find shelter for the night. There are motels around, but none of them will serve African Americans. So what many people resorted to was sleeping on the side of the road. So that is what I was trying to illustrate in my sort of scene, was the need to sleep on the side of the road despite there being a vacant motel. So as for how I actually made it, I did it in virtual reality, creating everything in that by hand, painstakingly. Every brush stroke, or every part of the wall is a brush stroke with my hand going like up and down. Every piece of land is by hand, every cactus, everything. Yeah, it was a pretty long process. The only thing that wasn't entirely by hand were the cars, and the motel buildings, which I made in a 3D modeling program and then imported into and painted on top of, though that wasn't entirely straightforward to paint on top of.
Hello, my name is Katsumi Higo, and my paper on Idealization of the North by Black Southerners attempts to answer the question, why, how, and to what extent did Black Southerners in the 20th century South idealize the North? My thesis is, Black Southerners idealized the North as a response to the devastating conditions of the Jim Crow South and frightening desperation for their realities to transform. Some of my main points include an introduction to the question, definition of some psychological terms as well as historical events, what was wrong with the South, the consequences of the aforementioned flaws, the idealization of the North in pop culture during this time period, how the North was idealized, to what extent the North was idealized, and an exploration of how the idealized North compared to the reality of the North during this time. The idealization of the North is a notion I picked up in class lectures and throughout my reading of The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, and this paper represents me exploring that question further. Thank you.
So for my final project, I decided to do a spoken word poem about the struggles that African Americans faced and the courage they displayed despite these obstacles. I write every now and then on the side, but I haven't really written anything of this caliber before, so it was an interesting process to get it done. My style of writing focuses on one aspect of symbolism as well as repetition, so I kind of incorporated that into the project. After writing the poem, I titled it Bittersweet Companion because I feel that the light served as a migrant's sense of hope through the good times and the bad, and no matter what they went through, it remained with them. I also tried to tie in themes that Wilkerson covered in her novel, like redlining, invisible hands, and disparity in education between white and black communities. I was really inspired by the poetry that preceded each chapter in The Warmth of Other Suns, as well as the epilogue. It relates to what we have learned as a class, and that my main point is that black people left the South for various reasons, and they still face discrimination wherever they went, but that didn't stop this mass movement of the 20th century. Bittersweet Companion by Tasneem Islam. There exists an unwavering light that lingers in the footsteps of the people that fought for the unalienable rights that were only foreign to them. It resides in the backs of buses and trains where ideas of revolution stirred. This light exists in the crinkled eyes that face the harsh southern heat for too long and watch their lives pass by with no real change. It exists in the laughter of people that came together in times of persistent uncertainty. This light angers, intimidates, and fearmongers, but remains with those that resist hate with peace. It exists in crowded tenements and segregated bathrooms, in courtrooms, in dilapidated schoolhouses, and in neighborhoods overtaken by gang violence. This light powers through invisible red lines and pedestals built on privilege. It travels city to city and incites a movement of people desperate to be free. This light has withstood the test of time, from the courage of young men and women that looked towards the North Star, to the children that grew up with opportunities their forefathers deemed impossible. This strength, this courage, this light, it exists in the people that worked too hard to get far too little. This is a light that comes in waves. And it's a miracle that despite all of the struggle, sacrifice, and separation, that this light is unwavering and exists in the darkest of corners.
My name is Sarah Khwaja, and I wrote a short story for my creative project. In my project, I tried to illuminate the issues of the Red Summer that took place in 1919 and the following Chicago race riots that occurred soon afterward, as a result of the Eugene Williams incident, which was when a young black boy named Eugene Williams was swimming in Lake Michigan and crossed an invisible color line separating the black side from the white side. He was stoned to death by white men, and those men were not arrested, and his murder caused a surge of upheaval in the black community. Violence soon broke out in the south side of Chicago, and the riots continued for many days, and black residences were torched by rioters. So my topic's relevance to the Great Migration is that it is a pivotal point for black resistance in America. The Red Summer was significant in the history of violence against black people because after World War I, black Americans came home with military training that was threatening to whites, and that led to them being targeted in riots that followed the end of the World War. African Americans returned home wearing the same uniforms as white men, and it spurred a shift in black civil rights. The war had more than just the purpose of supporting the American cause, because it was also the beginning of a movement towards claiming equality for black people in America. This anxiety, tied with the influx of black people from the South to the North caused by the Great Migration, led to a tension that was increasingly palpable. Black veterans were the foundation that allowed African Americans to fight back. I made this project because I wanted to learn more about Red Summer, and while reading The Warmth of Other Suns and doing research for this class, I found one of the most interesting dynamics to be between the white and black workers of the same factories. I wanted to illuminate the tension in the everyday life of someone who works in an essential job during the war, and show how social and racial dynamics existed between black and white people. I chose a short story because it allows me to skip around in time and include not only the tensions of the Red Summer, but also it lets me elaborate on the riots that followed that event. And So what I wanted to convey was the cowardly nature of Eddie in the story and how the ending totally counters the notion that the reader has of him so far. I wanted to create a conclusion that fit with the reality of the event, as many white and black people died in the riots. And of course, not all white people died in the way Eddie does in the story, but I wanted to have a little bit of an optimistic, hopeful lens to end the story with. In my story, I highlight the fact that Eddie is a white male. At first, he doesn't really understand the significance and privilege of that. As the story progresses, he uses his privilege to speak out and then step out unnoticed, and then to defend his black friend from hate and violence. I chose for him to be portrayed as cowardly because I wanted him to find that courage in the story, kind of like how the Cowardly Lion does in The Wizard of Oz. But he finds his courage and realizes what is right in the end. So I wrote Eddie as the main character of my story because I wanted a white man who obviously has this inherent privilege, and I wanted, like, during the story for us to be able to see him recognize his position in society as well as make a friend who obviously doesn't have this privilege. So he makes this friend named LMA, and he feels very strongly whenever he sees any cop or anyone being like violent towards her, and he kind of realizes that this is fundamentally unfair. So towards the end of the story, we kind of see a shift in his character where he starts to realize that he can use his privilege to shield himself or to camouflage himself among like white people, the violent white people who are trying to cause the black people harm. And he uses his privilege kind of in order to defend his friend.
The basis of my research paper is the investigation of current discrimination against African Americans and looking into how that changed or stayed the same since the policies enacted during the Great Migration. I selected this topic because I was interested in the connection between the two and wanted to further educate myself on the topic as well, particularly in terms of our modern-day issues. My thesis for the paper was that the de facto discrimination of the North during the Great Migration continues to plague the United States to this day, remaining deeply rooted in American culture and continues to echo the events of the past. My main points were that many African Americans today suffer from discrimination when applying for certain jobs, and suffer from a lower salary compared to their white counterparts, which in turn causes a large wealth gap between the two. Aside from this, they also suffer from segregation in neighborhoods and in schools, which further perpetuates the wealth gap, and thus harms the possibilities of integration. I then go on to address the nature of this discrimination, which I identify as a subconscious bias that can be difficult to identify, and finally go on to talk about how these issues today relate to policies during the Great Migration. The relationship between my essay and The Warmth of Other Suns is rather obvious, as I pull from the book somewhat often within my essay, and also address several of the issues they mention throughout the book. More than that, though, the plight of African Americans throughout the history of the United States has been a very common topic for us to touch upon during class, and it was also a very significant part of our history.
Hi there, my name is Adriana Lopez Cajigas, and this is my creative project, a painting titled, It Is Not That Simple. In my painting, I decided to portray what the Great Migration escaped from to what it entered to. The left side of the painting represents the South, while the right side of the painting represents the North. The train represents one of the more common forms of transportation in which black migrants used to get to the North. The transformation of cloudy to bright shows the superficial belief of what the North would be. The deep issues are hidden below the soil. In the left side are problems like lynching and murdering, which were more common in the South. Meanwhile, the right side is still segregated. In the middle, a sign titled Colored Only is pointing towards the train. This represents that only colored people suffered during this exodus. This piece was done on a cardboard to represent the poverty most African Americans lived through this time. My project was inspired by 1860s and 1880s propaganda paintings, which urged people to move west while declaring that it was a paradise for farming. In reality, it was already inhabited by Native Americans, and the farm was not that fertile. I decided to do my painting this way because it relates to terms that we have learned in class that have inspired me. Terms such as redlining and blockbusting and white flight are all things that you could pick and point out in my painting. Thank you.
This spoken poem by Salma Oncayo Reyes follows a colored woman's path through life and all of the changes and challenges she will face. She remains resilient in the face of adversity. She remains herself. She retains her drive. This woman is in all of us, and every generation brings her closer to her dream. The stream of an existence not marred by innate resilience, living instead of surviving. Please be advised that this poem may be triggering or frightening to some because of its subject matter.
Now, when I say resilient, what comes to mind? Something compressed and squashed and bent and stretched and doubled over in manners unkind, and yet it returns to its shape. Maybe a rubber band, or a rope, or a branch, or a reed, or a woman. Take the word apart some more. Resilient. She was born into the world too small. What use could she be when she's brown? And she, just despite them, she grows and sings and runs and eats grass and climbs trees and likes pink and blue and sunshine. Not proper, not prim. She's too wild in all whims. She's brown and untethered, worst of all sins, this. Resilient, she. He shows interest in her. How very touching. 15 is old enough to wed and bed and birth. Finally a use for she, since before she had none. A child not once she is made to make one. She knows what it's like and will change what she was shown. Resilient, she. The gun he keeps is safety and must be insured. A right that's God-given. Not a God I want to meet. But he sees her there, resilient she, with her books and pale and a dress to the knees, and she's brown and alone. Good thing he has a gun, 'cause he needs what he needs, and a dress to the knees or the ankles or none seems much to imply that she wants him to come. Cursed the day she decided to walk, to sing, to eat grass and like pink and blue in sunshine, because no matter the place or the time or the where, he does what he wants. Her dress on the floor, there's blood in her mouth and in her eyes and in her mind. Cursed he that thought she was not resilient, she. The kid will be just a little less brown, she thinks, and she hopes and she wills he can pass off as not. But he does not fit in, and he's bullied and worn. Your mom's a whore, he will hear and abhor. Maybe she shouldn't have asked for it. Maybe she should have been wearing something more modest. Maybe he shouldn't. No, he's never to blame. Still, he tosses her against the wall again and again and again, and the makeup won't work. Resilient she asks for help and gets none from anywhere. They all say her pain is made up. It's all in her head, and she doesn't have coverage, so there's no need to fret. It hurts, she cries out. Something's not right. Please help me out. And no one did heed her till she was deep underground. Resilient she. Numbers and figures all race through her head. The bugs in the trees count their legs. Are they red? How much thrust does a spaceship need to get out of this world? It's covered in hatred for all the brown girls. They are curious and bright, always having to be the best. For she can't succeed without being 5 times, no, 10 times, 1,000 times better than all of the he's who think she has brains made solely for whims. Or cooking, or cleaning, or kid rearing, or moaning, or dressing, or primping, or pleasing, or nothing. Resilient she works harder and faster for less than she is worth. She knows what she is, though. She's brains and she is power. Soon she says, resilient she. Now where are you from? How exotic you look. Bet you're an immigrant since you're brown from the hood. You must be in the cleaning service, he yells from the door. Why don't you come over and I'll show you some fun? When he's done with, She cleans and she scrubs and she sobs. She's handed a $5 tossed down on the floor, the tears in her eyes dry. She needs the money, so she takes it and bides her time. Back to the slums where she's forced to live. She cannot escape. There's no help and no funds. Resilient she. Women of color have been on the sidelines every second of every day of every year of all our lives. We work more and take more, and still we trudge on. Yes, Parks and Taylor, Padilla, Butler and Perkins and Wells and Burrow and Terrell and Cooper, Franklin and Simone, Sonny and Ida Mae with Wilkerson and Margarita and her mother and Stanton and de Beauvoir and Roosevelt, Dietrich and Frieden and Steinem and Davis with Hooks and Walters and King and Angelo, Miss Lord and Ginsburg and Ono, Miss Walker and Winfrey and Clinton and von Fustenberg, Madonna and Sandberg, Yusufazi and Nozi Adichie and Jolie, Beyonce and Gay and Miss Mock and Watson and Colors and Burke and Obama and Vaughn and Jackson and Clooney and Ocasio-Cortez and Klein and Cleaver and LaDuke and Cox and Tubman and Johnson and any woman who has ever paved the way through any and every hardship she has ever been dealt. I bless you more than anyone, you who have been raped. I thank you more than anyone, you who have been abused. I respect you more than anyone, you who have the courage to become a woman. I love you more than anyone, you who have still shown kindness despite how you have grown. I sing for you more than anyone, you who have worked for nothing just to survive. I wish for you more than anyone, you have been told you could not just because of your color and sex. I applaud for you more than anyone, you who have been both parents with none of the glory. I pray for you more than anyone, the battered and beat. I fight for you more than anyone, you who call out for justice. You who have given everything and are still considered the lowest of the bunch. I hope for me that I can have even a fraction of your might and change their views more towards what's right, so that we no longer have to be resilient she's. Resilience, your name is woman.
Hello, my name is Hong Wen, and my research paper focused on how there is a lasting imprint of the government's imposed segregation of African Americans to this day. African American families largely missed out on the American dream during a time period of growing wages and affordable housing. The Federal Housing Administration borrowed loans to Black families. Massive developments that received funding were heavily segregated as well. Government-sponsored institutions discriminated against African Americans through the use of public housing, zoning laws, mortgage insurance programs, and collusion and vigilante violence. This discrimination during those time periods resulted in a large disparity in wealth, partly due to missing out on home value appreciation. Neighborhoods and communities are even still segregated to this day. This can be partly attributed to real estate agents using poor school performance as a proxy for modern-day redlining.
This photograph illustrates a mask illusion made with makeup. The use of a mask is used to highlight and showcase the fact that even though we all possess unique exterior qualities, we never stop being human beings underneath. In my personal case, I express my art form through a makeup platform that allows me to transform into anything I could imagine. Though I am susceptible to hate commentary because a man in makeup is not very ordinary, it has helped me build a thick skin that helps me ignore such comments. At the end of the day, I can wash it off and go back to being a regular person just like everybody else. This is a major point I wanted to highlight in this mask illusion, that even though we wear masks that differentiate us through race, skin color, hair texture, sexual preference, etc., we are still humans underneath and should respect and appreciate those qualities and traits that make us unique.
This semester, one of our required readings was titled The Warmth of Other Suns, following the lives of 3 African Americans as I try to navigate life in a post-Civil War society. Specifically, the novel focused on the Great Migration, a mass movement of African Americans from the South to the western and northern parts of the United States. The cities that they settled in, like Chicago and Detroit, saw a dramatic explosion in population and therefore urbanization. My thesis for my paper was, African Americans have been sucked into an inescapable cycle of poverty worsened by a flawed justice system and an equally flawed political atmosphere. Therefore, the United States has waged a war behind closed doors against African Americans, leaving a huge conglomerate of individuals defenseless against an invisible enemy. In my research paper, I dug deeper into how these major cities became so impoverished and discovered the inner workings of a flawed justice system. I go over a brief history of the Civil War and highlight topics such as the war on drugs, the New Deal, and the continuation of poverty because of those aforementioned factors, as well as analyzing statistics for crime and drug use rates.
The mask we wear was part of a personal effort to explain the class and race struggles that the United States faced constantly in history and on the road of the civil rights movement. Despite beliefs that segregation and discrimination was free immediately after the Civil War, the United States was still deeply divided by mindsets of prejudice that lasted long after it was supposed to end. The United States, displaying a gilded appearance of democracy, often incurred terrible actions that repressed the freedoms of many people in not just other countries, but also within the people within itself. From discrimination that African Americans faced on the journey for the civil rights, to the United States imperialism in Latin America and other countries, the United States suffered enormous struggle in practicing the rights that they said they stood for. The masks we wear. We hide ourselves behind the mask we wear, a face that we don't want the world to see, faces holding dreams unkept, some glimmering with hope, others full of dissatisfaction, behind a persona of what they want us to be. People judge the masks we wear. They don't understand the intricacies, old, unique carvings we can't change, yet full of identical features, much the same. Never compassion and always contempt. That's all the world wants us to perceive. We hide ourselves behind the masks we wear, some still clutching their rugged masks, scared of letting them see. Others dropping their artificial guise, unafraid to face the world, finally able to be free.
For my project, I wrote a song called Promised Land. It was based on the character Dr. Foster in The Warmth of Other Suns. I wanted the song to express a lot of his frustration and emotion. He thinks that California will be this promised land, that it will be so much better than the South, but he realizes that no matter how much he accomplishes, he can't run from his race and that there will always be prejudice around him. From this class, I've learned that mindsets and ideologies don't change easily. They don't disappear easily. And so they can change forms and appear in different ways, but they don't necessarily completely disappear. I really enjoyed doing this song because it really made me think about what people like Dr. Pershing went through, and it allowed me to get a little creative and express some emotion.
I heard of a place with no race, with no hate. I wanna go there, 'cause this life that I'm living, it is not my decision. I am chained with precision. I want a moment of hope to discover a place of freedom, a place where I am uninhibited. Options aren't limited. Even if I go coast to coast, I still cannot find a host, a place for my head to lay. Even if I can pay, go to the promised land. Just take me there, give me your hand. I devised a plan, but now that I'm here, I understand that things don't change. No matter where I go, my skin color follows. My skin is my biggest affliction, a lasting condition. No matter how much I accomplish, they'll still find ways to demolish me and admonish me. Tell me honestly, am I ever free? It's mentally draining to always be proving my worth. All the rejection, I tell you, it hurts. They still trying to break me, berate and degrade me. The streets here are ruthless. They didn't tell me the truth is, wherever I go, my skin color follows. That's all they see. That's all they need to define me. I wanna go to the promised land. Just take me there, give me your hand. I devised a plan, but now that I'm here, I understand that things don't change. No matter where I go, my skin color follows. I wanna go to the promised land. Just take me there, give me your hand. No matter where I go, my skin color follows. My skin color follows. Skin color follows.
The inspiration for this rap was the problem of internalized racism we see in our society to this day, and we saw many parallels in the book we read, which was The Warmth of Other Suns, and many facts of today's day and age, like Colin Kaepernick and Trayvon Martin, and those are just some of the many examples we see on a daily basis.
Please note that the rap Internalized Racism contains profanity.
Here's a problem that needs to be addressed. Society is flawed, but we can change it. We live in a system of internalized racism. Like, what the fuck? Alright, I'm sitting here, I'm sipping. This Henny got me thinking. Our nation really tripping. What makes me so different? People make jokes but don't want to smoke. We're all the same, respect on the name. I shoot you once and that's in your brain. Guess what? Your blood is red, mine is too, but now you're dead. Lesson learned. Don't hate, grow together, share the blame. And this goddamn useless pain. Don't let these bars go in vain, cause we can reach the top with unselfish thought. Don't think twice, cause my skin's different on God. Yeah, I was bullied all my life, cut deeper than a knife. Never understood people from my hood switching up left and right. My fantasy is a world where we all succeed. No racism, no discrimination, just vibes. History repeats itself. This should be a cry for help. Let me tell y'all about racism and the pain itself. There was a man named Pershing Foster, and he was a doctor. He was treated like a fucking hostile. Fought for his country, but they did him dirty. That's not it, there's more to go. America is such a hoe. Racism stays afloat. The hand was the original boat. Gave a rise to a mentality where whites were right and the colored people just had to listen, or they end up fucking missing. You could try to go, but you already know the white man will stop your flow. Try to get a job to pay your loans, but then you're told that a college student has no need. Well, to sign agreed, they're smoking some kind of weed. It's sad, man. People still getting shot on the corner, every block, day and night. Hateful cops harassing us without any thought. Young Travion lost his life. Young Kaepernick lost his job. All because he stood for what's right. No, wait, he took a knee to be free. That's a threat. Just another man trying to do what's right. Is that allowed in America? Not quite. What a fucking shameful sight. Fills the mind with spite. I'm just trying to shed some light. Alright, listen. Internalized racism is something we should have fixed a long time ago. But the fact that we're seeing it in the past and now, it's just crazy. Let's get together and let's do something. Peace out.
For my project, I created fiber art pieces about the racial wealth gap in America. I dyed cotton cloth pieces and embroidered on them statistics from modern day that were influenced by generations of inequality. I chose cotton and embroidery as my medium to relate to the laborious process of cotton farming, which was a cornerstone in the American economy in the Jim Crow era. The efforts and sacrifices of blacks in this era were not rewarded fairly, and this inequality of wealth carried on to the present day, in which blacks are struggling to be compensated and treated fairly.
Upon reading The Warmth of Other Suns, one of the themes that were constantly expressed was the racial divides that resulted from Jim Crow and the caste system in place, and how it has continued to affect the future prospects of African Americans for the generations that followed. As we learned in class, with redlining, restrictive covenants, blockbusting, and several other segregating systems, America is still racially segregated from these deeply rooted systems of the past. Because of Jim Crow's importance in the proceedings of the Great Migration, I wanted to touch upon this theme a little further. I chose a poem to cover the experiences of Jim Crow and the decision to leave the South because I felt that poetry can most accurately capture emotion, but in a very subtle and symbolic way. This was especially the case as many sections of Wilkerson's book would begin with an excerpt from a poem. For me, I felt like these poets remarking about the events in the book with such symbolic and personal language was instrumental in connecting me emotionally to the story of not only these individuals, but also to the Great Migration as a whole. Shifting fears. Night falls upon the endless fields, enveloping the land in darkness, and the toiling bodies shuffle into their shacks and cabins, with trails of sweat sharing a story of a hard day's work. A heavy burden plagues the mind, heavier than the sacks of today's yield, heavier than the air that surrounds a belligerent and unwelcoming land, heavier than the branches of many southern trees. What future lies in a land like this? A future devoid of dignity and freedom, with dreams nothing more than a distant passing comfort, and fear that is more tangible than their wealth. As they are laid bare and constricted, the crow continues to feed off their already lifeless bodies. As the walls cave in, cementing their fates in place, a glistening light, faint in the distance, pours through the cracks, and along with it a smooth tune is played to the ears of the discontented. It touches the fear of many and the dreams of few, promising a better life anew in a richer land. But whether it is fear or optimism guiding the heart to leave, it is clear that there is no moving up in the South. And with the curtains of Jim Crow closing in, all that mattered was that it was somewhere other than here. Along the wider streets of an alien city, a sweeter aroma lifts the spirits of those who have followed its trail. Back straight with determination, men walk with purpose. Although they are still obscured by the shadow of a more fortunate man, there is a tighter grasp of what was lost before, and an even tighter grasp of what was now gained. And with their heads skyward bound, there is no looking back. That cold and heartless land, for its bitterness cannot be stomached any more, and its silence does not entail peace. Now, as the crow goes hungry, night falls upon those empty fields, enveloping that land in darkness.